Welcome. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am director of UC Berkeley's Social Science Matrix. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you today to our book salon, where we will discuss the new book by LaFleur Stephens-Dougan. The book is titled Race to the Bottom: How Racial Appeals Work in American Politics. Now, before we begin, as is customary, let me just tell you about another exciting event coming up next week. On May 14th, we will have a Matrix on Point event titled America's Pursuit of Racial Justice, where our panelists will discuss the critical momentum of Black-led protests and the Black Lives Matter movement over the past year, but also put it in the broader historical context. Now, without further ado, let me introduce today's panelists. I'll begin with LaFleur. I don't know if you can turn on your video, LaFleur. All right, there you are. So LaFleur Stephens-Dougan earned her PhD in public policy and political science from the University of Michigan in 2013. Her research interests include racial attitudes, Black politics, and public opinion. Now, her brand new book, which we're discussing today, was published by the University of Chicago Press in fall 2020. Dr. Stephens-Dougan's research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Russell Sage Foundation. And her work has been published or is forthcoming. There's a lot of papers forthcoming in the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, and the Annual Review of Political Science. And next, we will have Taeku Lee. If Taeku, yes, here you are. So Taeku Lee is Professor of Political Science and George Johnson Professor of Law here at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also the director of Berkeley's Jurisprudence and Social Policy program, and he actually wears many more hats, and I cannot, name them all. He's a specialist in racial and ethnic politics, Asian American politics and policy, opinion polling and survey research, and election law and political participation. He is the author or editor of many books, including Mobilizing Public Opinion, Black Insurgency and Racial Attitudes in the Civil Rights Era, published in 2002. And Why Americans Don't Join the Party, Race, Immigration, and the Failure of Political Parties to Engage the Electorate, published in 2011. Professor Lee is also co-principal investigator of the National Asian American Survey and managing director of Asian American Decisions. He has served in numerous leadership positions, including as a member of the National Advisory Committee for the US Census Bureau and member of the Board of Overseers of the National American Election Studies. So today's event is a book salon, so we will, we'll begin with LaFleur's introduction of her book, and then Taeku will offer some comments and generate the conversation. So thank you both so much for what promises to be a wonderful exchange. And without further ado, LaFleur is for you.
Great. Thank you, Marion, for that kind introduction. So first, I really want to just take the opportunity to thank the folks at the UC Berkeley Social Science Matrix for the opportunity to share my work today. I really do owe a special debt of gratitude to Jessica Stewart, Marion Fourcade, Sarah Lee, and all of the other people who have worked behind the scenes to make this talk possible today. And of course, I would like to thank Taeku Lee for taking the time, because he obviously does wear very, many hats. So for taking the time to be in conversation with me today about my book, Race to the Bottom. So my book, Race to the Bottom, is about how politicians employ both visual and rhetorical strategies to navigate some white Americans' racial animus. And so I'm going to begin to share my screen, and then we can get into sort of the meat of the argument. Okay, so the central argument of my book is really that politicians across the racial and political spectrum can and often do engage in what I refer to as racial distancing. And racial distancing is a political strategy whereby some politicians want to indicate to racially moderate and racially conservative whites that they will not disrupt the racial status quo, right? In other words, that they will not be too beholden to often their Black constituents, but also communities of color more broadly. And this racial status quo is characterized, I would argue, by racial inequality with whites at the top of the hierarchy, including white dominance in, political, social, and economic institutions. However, the degree to which politicians are really able to engage in this racial distancing is influenced by both their partisanship and their race, right? So when politicians are running for office, and I'm talking in the case of like national elections, statewide elections, or majority white jurisdictions, there is, I would argue, this incentive to show that they're not going to cater to African-American interests, but there's also a political tightrope that they have to walk to show that they are also not racially insensitive, right? So you can't be completely, well, to some degree, you cannot be completely racially inflammatory. And I can talk about what sort of combinations of both a racial and partisan identity either sort of enhance this type of messaging or are able to temper that type of messaging. And so one of the takeaway points or one of the ideas that I developed in the book is this idea of racialized partisan stereotypes. And that's the idea that the sort of stereotypes that we have of the two major parties are either tempered or enhanced by the race of the politician associated with the party. And so I'm gonna, pull up a figure and get into a little bit more detail about what that means. But as we've all witnessed in recent years, partisanship in American politics is increasingly interconnected with race, right? White Americans are more likely to belong to the Republican Party, while people of color are more likely to belong to the Democratic Party. We also know that the United States is witnessing, great demographic change, but even amidst this demographic change, the majority of the American electorate is still white. And so in national elections and elections in any majority white jurisdictions, they still have to be concerned, politicians that is, with winning the votes of white Americans, or at the very least, to some degree, not alienating or losing too many white votes, right? So we know, for example, that, no Democratic presidential nominee has won the majority of the white vote since, Lyndon Johnson, right? And so in some cases, maybe they're not trying to win the majority, but they're in some cases, I think, concerned with, not hemorrhaging and not losing too many white voters. And this has implications for the sort of strategies that they pursue and how they talk about race. So again, if recent history has taught us anything, it's that race, I would argue, and we can see from recent history, that race is still one of the most salient political divides in American politics. And so to help orient today's talk today, I'd like to begin with showing you a figure that I think helps to explain why politicians often pursue a strategy of racial distancing. And it also explains just about how they talk about race and why they might talk about race in particular ways. I should also note that this is very much oriented around sort of a Black-white political divide. Obviously, talking to you folks in California, we know that politics is not just solely Black and white, but I would argue that that Black-white political divide is still the sort of most salient one for race in American politics, although that's changing amidst the growing demographic diversity. Okay, so what I'd like to show you here is a figure that I created based on survey data from the American National Election Study. Now, the American National Election Study is sort of the gold standard in American public opinion. And, they interview people essentially every 4 years about a variety of political attitudes and opinions, racial attitudes, and things of that nature. What I'm showing you here is a question that's been asked in every year since 1974, where people are asked to rate themselves on a scale as to whether they see themselves as supporting government aid to Blacks, or on the other end of the spectrum, the idea that African Americans should help themselves, right? And so this is a 7-point scale, and this sort of dotted line here that you see represents the white Americans' opinion on this idea of aid to Blacks, right? So this is where they're rating themselves in terms of supporting the sort of more liberal end of that scale that I'm talking about, the idea that government should give aid to African Americans. And you can see that over time, this graph goes from 1974 to 2016, that basically this idea of aid to Blacks is not necessarily, especially popular. What's also interesting is that they rate the two major parties, and you can see here that this other dotted line or hash line represents where they rate the Republican Party in terms of this idea of providing aid to Blacks. And so one takeaway that I'd like you to get from this figure is that where white Americans rate themselves on this issue is much closer to where they perceive the Republican Party as being on this matter. The other kind of line that you should be following is this solid line that shows where they rate the Democratic Party. And you can see that over time, especially, this perception of the Democratic Party's stance on aid to Blacks is one in which the Democratic Party is kind of, essentially perceived as the party that aids Blacks, and it's also very distant from where the average white American sees themselves on this issue. And so why does this matter? Well, for one, as I noted earlier, race and racial matters are still one of, if not the most salient divides in American politics. Two, it means that the perception of the Democratic Party on this salient political matter is out of step with the average white American. I argue that this has implications for how politicians from both parties navigate race, and it also influences what stereotypes white voters have of politicians and how politicians might try to overcome these stereotypes. So the next figure that I'm going to walk you through is the results of a survey experiment that was conducted on a nationally diverse sample of roughly 650 white Americans. This was conducted in 2017, and these data come from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. In this survey, I randomly assigned the white Americans in the sample to essentially one of four types of politicians: Black Democrats, Black Republicans, white Democrat, or white Republican politician. And people, when they were randomly assigned to their particular type of politician, were asked a question as to whether they thought that that politician favored, that type of politician on average favored Blacks over whites, whites over Blacks, or would treat both groups the same. And this is on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 represents favoring Blacks over whites, 1 would represent favoring whites over Blacks, and again, at this halfway point, the idea that they would treat both groups the same. And so what I'd like you to take from this is, if you note, as we go along from Black Democrat, Black Republican, white Democrat, white Republican, there are varying perceptions in terms of how these types of politicians are going to treat these two groups, right? So for one, the Black Democratic politician on average has a rating of 0.31, which means that they're much closer to being perceived as looking out for the interests of African Americans. White Democrats, on the other hand, for example, have a mean rating of about 0.43. And this difference in the Black Democrat from the white Democrat is statistically significant, which just means, for the lay people in the audience, that these differences are statistically, they're distinguishable, that they're meaningful, and there's something about, a Black Democrat and where his sort of perceived loyalties lie that are very different from the white politician from the same party. And funny enough, or maybe not surprising to some of you, is that the Black Republican is actually rated closer to the Black Democrat in terms of where a Black Republican's perceived loyalties lie. And again, I would argue that this has implications for the sort of political strategies that these politicians pursue. I'd also note that going back to this concept of racialized partisan stereotypes, that essentially being a Black Republican, that racial cue of Black helps to kind of overwhelm the partisan stereotype that's associated with the Republican Party. And arguably for the white Democrat, the racial cue of white maybe tempers some of the perception of, racial liberalism of the Democratic Party. This doesn't mean that they don't have concerns about this or they don't navigate concerns about their perceived racial liberalism, but relative to, say, their Black counterparts, they arguably have more latitude as part of the argument in terms of how they can talk about race, and presumably do so in a more sort of racially liberal manner relative to their Black counterparts. Also of note here is that for the sort of average rating of the white Republican politician, it's at about a 0.61. You can see that the white Republican politician is the only one that's above sort of this halfway mark of treating both groups the same, meaning that they're also closer to the perception of favoring the interests of whites. And again, which I would argue has implications for the strategies that they might be able to pursue. What's also interesting about this is that, at least to me, is that the Black Democrat and the white Republicans kind of flank both ends of the sort of spectrum there, and that the white Republicans' rating is about a third of the scale higher than that of the Black Democrat. So if you do buy the definition, Lasswell's definition of what politics is about, and that politics is about who gets what, when, and how, then you'll understand that these perceptions of politicians as favoring some groups more than others has meaningful political implications. Given these perceptions of the two major parties on race and Black and white politicians from these parties on race, I argue that white Republican politicians, when they're trying to attract the electoral support of racially moderate and racially conservative whites, which, by our measures of racial attitudes in American politics, actually constitutes the majority of white Americans, white Republican politicians are thereby incentivized to remind white voters of their sort of reputation for enforcing the racial status quo or the racial hierarchy, right? And so that's why you often see, and it's maybe easy to kind of point to the low-hanging fruit of, say, a Donald Trump sort of invoking race, or kind of reminding his racially conservative base about his party's reputation, and white Republican politicians in particular, their reputation for enforcing the racial hierarchy. On the other hand, a politician like Joe Biden, a white Democrat, I would argue has had more latitude to talk about race in a sort of more racially liberal manner than, say, his Black counterpart, Barack Obama. So, thinking about Biden, for example, and trying to tie some of the theory to more real world politics, if you think about his platform, and we've just kind of passed the mark of 100, the first 100 days of his presidency, right? Racial equality was a central part of his platform. He campaigned on restoring the soul of the nation, and he was also elected after naming systemic racism as one of the 4 major crises facing the nation. And so if we think about, even in the wake of the conviction of former police officer Derek Chauvin, President Biden, said something that I don't think we've maybe heard recent presidents say, and definitely talked about race in a way that was, I would say, markedly different from, say, President Obama. So Biden says, we have all seen the knee of injustice on the neck of Black Americans. And if we contrast some of this behavior and rhetoric with that of former President Obama, you might recall in the aftermath of the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin, Obama famously said, "If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon." Now, of course, the context between these two incidents was different, but what I'm doing here is trying to highlight the difference in these two statements to note that Biden was able to more explicitly talk about the injustice facing Black America, whereas Obama arguably gave a statement that, while empathetic, I would argue, lacked any sort of real mention of racial injustice facing African Americans. And, we could also argue that throughout his presidency, he actually went to great lengths to be seen as, quote, the president for all Americans, as opposed to the president of Black Americans. And, just as, an attempt to bring this closer to our sort of real world, everyday politics, you might have seen some recent polling that suggests that, at the 100-day mark, Americans see Biden as more moderate than Obama, although arguably Biden has maybe, at least at this stage, pursued a more sort of progressive or liberal agenda, right? So at the 100-day mark of his presidency, close to 60% of registered voters were perceiving Obama as liberal or very liberal, whereas at this same point, about 44% of registered voters are perceiving Biden as liberal or very liberal at the same point. And sort of what the takeaway here is, and what I show in the book, is that Black politicians on their face are perceived as more liberal, which, goes with the long line of, previous race and politics research. But what I also show is that the messaging that they pursue when they maybe give a more sort of racially conservative message can often help them make inroads with racially conservative whites. I personally am not advocating this as a political strategy, to be clear. I'm just here as an objective, social science researcher and testing a theory about what helps to move white voters often, particularly those who are racially moderate and conservative. And so I'm going to also just briefly, in the time that I have left, maybe talk a little bit about one study from my book, and then I really want to leave time for us to have more of a conversation and for me not to just be talking to the screen. But I did, conduct an experiment on a nationally representative sample of 500 whites via a survey firm called Knowledge Networks. And what I did was randomly assign people to one of three messages from a Black Democrat who either gave a deracialized message, right? So one that was devoid of any mention of race, one that was implicit, which by the definition of the literature means that they talked about race, but in a way that was sort of racially coded, right? So in this case, they used the term inner city to signal race, but without ever mentioning Black people or African Americans. And then explicit would mean that it used a racial noun like African American. So people were reading in this experiment an article about a candidate who had run for governor who was giving a speech about getting out the vote. And I measured their racial attitudes in a pre-test, and then there was a 1 week sort of lag time before they got exposed to the article and then answered a series of questions about the candidate and the article that they read. So the deracialized appeal, they're just told, Democratic candidate to voters, get to the voting booth. I'm just pulling, quote, if elected, I will continue to create jobs that offer a hand up for everyone across the state. And they also, in the actual article, see a picture of this person to signal that they were African American. In the implicit appeal, it's basically the same language, but the Democratic candidate to inner city voters quit complaining and get to the voting booth. And again, if elected, I will continue to create jobs that offer hand up, but also not a handout, right? Which we know in terms of some of the sort of stereotypes around African Americans and perceptions of government dependence. This is more of an implicit appeal. And then the explicit appeal is the same as the implicit one, except that it mentions actually Black voters. And so what I've done here is just show basically for the voters in the sample, how likely they were to vote for the candidate with the implicit or explicit message relative to the deracialized message that, didn't talk about race. And what you can see here is that in terms of likely vote, they had an opportunity to say that they would vote for the candidate on a scale of basically from 0 to 100. So, the higher you go, the more likely they were to vote for the candidate. In the deracialized condition, it's at about 52, kind of, a toss-up between whether they would vote for the candidate or not. But what you can see here is that with the addition of this either implicit or explicit message, there was sort of a taste or an appreciation for a message that invoke these stereotypes either implicitly or explicitly relative to sort of the more deracialized universal message. People also were asked to rate the message. And similarly, you can see that they were sort of nonplussed about the message in the deracialized condition, but when they got either the explicit or the implicit message, the takeaway here is that they rated the speech more positively. I've also broken that out by the partisanship of the respondents. You can see that among white Democrats, this is not as it's still more popular relative to the deracialized message, but where they're able to really, this Black Democratic candidate that is, make inroads is with white Republican voters, where there's a real sort of boost or electoral incentive for them to use this message if they're trying to attract, white Republicans. And the same goes for the rating of the speech. And then here I'm just showing you the predicted probability of voting for the candidate as a function, not just of their partisanship, as I showed you previously, but now as a function of their racial attitudes. So, people were asked essentially to rate, this is a standard question that we use in American politics, to rate white Americans on how hardworking or lazy they are on a 7-point scale, and also to do the same for African Americans, taking the difference of the two. Basically, if people rate the two as equally hardworking, then they're kind of perceived as neutral or not endorsing a stereotype. If they rate Blacks on average as more hardworking, then they would be perceived as, what I'm calling pro-Black here. And if they rate African Americans as less hardworking, then they would be perceived as what I'm referring to here as anti-Black. And basically the takeaway here is that the majority of the sample would be rated either as neutral or endorsing an anti-Black stereotype around work ethic. And when it comes to the likelihood of voting for the candidate, both voters who were neutral or saw both groups as equally hardworking are more likely to vote for the Black Democratic candidate with the implicit or explicit message. And the same also holds true for those who had endorsed the anti-Black stereotype. And so the takeaway here is that there is some political utility for Black Democratic candidates to maybe engage in some of this messaging when trying to attract white voters. Again, this is not a strategy that I'm advocating, but this is an opportunity to test some of the sort of longstanding theories that we have had about racial messaging, namely that universal messages, afford Black politicians, or deracialized messages afford them an opportunity to do well electorally. And part of my argument here is that a deracialized message doesn't necessarily provide enough information on the salient sort of divide of race in American politics. And so this implicit and explicit messaging does send that message that they're not too beholden to their African-American constituents. And if we think back to, the figures that I showed earlier in terms of stereotypes of Black Democratic politicians in particular, you might see why they may be incentivized to use this type of messaging. But I'll leave it here for now, and we can maybe have more of a free-flowing conversation about what the implications are for this about politics. People like Kamala Harris, Tim Scott, both of who made comments in recent days around, America's history of racism and, discussions around whether America is a racist country. But I'll leave it here for now, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, LaFleur, for the great introduction to your book. I'm just going to dive right in because I want to be sure that we have time for audience Q&A as well. So I was really happy to be asked to comment on Race to the Bottom. As a self-anointed honorary member of the so-called Michigan Mafia of Race Scholars, I've known about Dr. Stephens-Dougan and the project leading up to this book, and have been following it with great interest for a number of years. So I'm thrilled to see the completed work. Race to the Bottom is a virtuoso piece of social science research that I think should sit on top of everyone's top shelf of books that helps us understand what is currently happening in American politics and how we got here. The book makes me much more hopeful about political science, which in all seriousness is not a low bar. As much as political scientists love to engage in a sort of professional self-flagellation about the excesses of disciplinary navel-gazing and the descent into methodological arcana at the cost of relevance, I actually think we're at an inflection point in the discipline that is due in part to the world around us and kind of the hair-raising blue funk scale of change, crisis, and chaos in the world around us, but also I think due in part due to changes in the demographics of who is doing political science research and changes in how the discipline is organized. So political scientists are responding to the moment with some exceptionally compelling scholarship, some of it from folks that you might know, senior scholars like Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt in How Democracies Die, and here at home, Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker's tetralogy of books on asymmetric polarization, plutocratic populism, and inequality. But I think we should also celebrate major contributions from a brilliant next generation of scholars, like Lauren Davenport's Politics Beyond Black and White, Bernard Fraga's The Turnout Gap, Ashley Jardina's White Identity Politics, Davin Phoenix's The Anger Gap, Chris Cepeda Milan's Latino Mass Mobilization, and of course, Dr. Stephens-Dougan's Race to the Bottom. Now, while there's good reason to be upbeat about political science and our willingness to tackle, again, big questions that matter urgently, I don't mean to imply that there's anything upbeat about what these major contributions tell us about the health of our democracy. Race to the Bottom picks up, at least as I read it, where Tali Mendelberg's The Race Card and where Paul Freimer's Uneasy Alliances left off, but I think on an even more somber downbeat. And The Race Card and Uneasy Alliances aren't sort of, stories of democratic uplift. In Mendelberg's account of racial priming, white candidates can play the race card for their electoral benefit by implicitly cueing race with white voters. That's helpful to understand how, say, Lee Atwater's strategy of flashing an image of a paroled Black man, William Horton, in an attack ad against Michael Dukakis as being soft on crime, resulted in Dukakis losing a 17 percentage point lead in late July and ultimately losing the 1988 election to George Bush by 6 percentage points. But that was over 2 decades ago. And the country has changed a lot. And in fact, the reemergence of kind of straight up ugly white nationalism in the past few years has probably made some of us nostalgic for the implicit cueing of race that Mendelberg identifies. So Stephens-Dougan offers a broader view of the dynamics of racial messaging by considering an electorate in which voters are both white and black, and in which candidates are also both white and black. Stephens-Dougan also brings us to the present, where it is no longer taboo or otherwise politically costly for a candidate to be explicit about race. You can engineer the hostile takeover of a national political party by being explicit about race. And it is not just explicit or implicit cues that matter. Stephens-Dougan's account of racial distancing makes a crucial, nuanced point that racial cues don't need to portray Black Americans negatively to have an effect on vote choices. In 2021, cues can be either positive or negative to affect one's electoral prospects, depending on whether it is a white or black candidate sending them, and importantly, depending on whether voters expect that candidate to govern partially to the benefit and to the interests of Black voters. Then in Uneasy Alliances, Paul Freimer surfaces the unintended racial cost of electoral competition, explaining how relatively small, ideologically distinctive voting segments like African Americans can be electorally captured, where Republicans have no incentives to woo their vote, where Democrats have little incentive to woo their votes too visibly for fear of losing more white votes than Black votes gained, and where, as a consequence, Black voters all too often find their issues ignored, their votes taken for granted, and see no better alternatives. So to this account, Stephens-Dougan further peels back the drywalls of race and party competition by showing us that it is not just parties that have no incentive to reach out to and be responsive to the needs and interests of the African American electorate. Rather, party competition in the context of racial polarization and the still plurality of white voters incentivizes even Black Democrats to engage in racial distancing and to publicly repudiate Black Americans, whether it is Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Black using the term thug, President Obama saying brothers should pull up their pants, or Black candidates just running campaign advertisements and staging photo opportunities where their Black constituents are rendered invisible. And as Race to the Bottom shows in the chapter on Obama, this kind of racial distancing can be proactive and in his speeches to Black audiences rather than just reactive and only crafted messages to white voters. So Race to the Bottom is thus a sobering account of the hapless incentives facing candidates Black and white and the hapless choices facing voters Black and white. It's a wonderful example of theoretical creativity and technical chops working together in magical harmony. Theoretically, Stephens-Dougan very carefully and even-handedly parses competing accounts of the dynamics of race in electoral politics today, racial priming, issue ownership, and deracialization. I'm going to try to skip through some comments so I can get to the questions sooner rather than later. I would, well, I'll definitely do this because I got to sell some books. There's more I could say to synthesize and set up this book for the audience, but let me just say, it's a wonderful book. Buy it. If you're a faculty member, read it and assign it to your students. If you're a graduate student or a newly minted scholar, I would say read it and use it as a model for designing a clean, concise, clever, and compelling dissertation, and then turning it into a critical contribution to scholarship. So let me turn now to the comments to start discussion, which are meant to have an arc that curves towards questions and curiosities that invite Dr. Stephens-Dougan's response. So for me, the questions are 5. None of these are particularly surprising or original, and they're just an invitation to elaborate, extrapolate, speculate based on the book. I'll pose the questions first and then elaborate on them. The 5 questions are: what about Trump? What about #BLM? What about Georgia? What about Ian Haney Lopez? And then what about Lenin? So what about Trump is to ask you to say more about whether your account changes or remains the same in light of Trump and Trumpism. Trump and Trumpism has been nearly uniquely disruptive and destructive, taking a wrecking ball not just to constitutional democracy in the US, but also to many a promising political science career that was based on our understanding of how we thought American politics worked circa 2015. I would say few of us honestly would publicly have predicted in 2015 the rise of a full-bore white nationalist, white supremacist tide, and with it an insurgent, insurrectionist, extremist fringe, successfully staging a coup of a major national party and then attempting a coup of our electoral democracy itself. So, to sharpen it a bit, isn't the genie of explicit racism, out of the bottle in a way that it simply wasn't when you began this book? And if that's right, what are the implications of that to your account of racial distancing? And to put an even sharper point on it, and this also applies to the next question I'll raise as well, you define racial distancing as a strategic ploy that candidates use to signal to white voters that they will not disrupt the racial status quo. But in the current moment of Trumpism and Black Lives Matter, what is the racial quo? Or is there even a racial status quo? What about Black Lives Matter is to ask you to say more about whether your account changes or remains the same in light of what many have dubbed the largest protest movement in US history, 30 million in the streets and growing. We saw 16 out of 27 Democratic candidates take variations of a positive position on reparations. We see today older white male cis-het candidates using terms like implicit bias and structural racism without flinching. If you're a Democratic candidate today, Black or white, doesn't it now hurt you to racially distance? And isn't it suddenly cool and electorally profitable to talk explicitly and positively about race? What about Georgia could be a couple of questions. It could be an invitation for you to say more about whether the logic of electoral politics in the past still holds today. So hasn't that logic changed from Paul Freimer's uneasy alliances, which is an era where, quaint as it may sound, politicians still followed the strategic imperative of the median voter theorem, to our current climate of polarization, where in states like Georgia, the difference between winning and losing is not so much a centrist move to modify the middle, but a fierce battle of ground games to mobilize the bases. If that's right, how does that change candidates' incentives for racial distancing? The other what about Georgia is an invitation to say more about how your theory and its implications travel beyond the black-white paradigm of US race relations. And I know we've had this discussion before, and you've talked about it a little bit today, and you have a couple of pages in your conclusion where you have some interesting insights about whether Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio themselves engage in a sort of racial distancing as well. But I think there's a slew of interesting and important unanswered questions still that putting race to the bottom up against the growing racial diversity of the US electorate generates. For instance, while it may be true that Cruz and Rubio vie to outdo one another in terms of immigrant bashing, what about Latinx Democrats running in non-majority Latinx districts? Are there examples of Latinx Democrats similar to President Obama, Michael Nutter, Harold Ford Jr., and so on? What should we expect in the case of Asian American candidates where the trope of being a model minority dominates? Would they also be incentivized to racially distance vis-a-vis that positive representation and stereotype? And what does your theory tell us to expect when candidates are, mixed race identity? Okay, I'll try to make the last two really quick. What about Ian Haney Lopez? Well, what about Ian Haney Lopez? Here, I want to put race to the bottom in conversation with Dog Whistle Politics and its sequel, Merge Left. The two of you largely share a diagnosis about what is going on with respect to race and electoral politics in the US today. But where I see you differing is in the alternatives to racial priming and racial distancing. So where Race to the Bottom finds evidence that a deracialized message that emphasizes commonality results in lowering electoral support compared to messages that either implicitly or explicitly disparage Blacks, Merged Left finds that a specific kind of deracialized message, which is what Ian calls the race-class narrative, that frames the fight against poverty as also a fight against racism and vice versa, actually outperforms both explicit appeals to racial justice and broadly colorblind appeals to economic populism. And it further finds that the race-class narrative, at least according to survey experiments in Merged Left, also successfully overrides appeals to racial fear and status quo threat. So here the question is not just what about Ian, but also what do you think generally about the prospects for messaging that might trans-racialize, if you will, instead of deracializing, find a lens that suggests a common path out of this race to the bottom. Which leads to the final question, what about Lenin, which is an invitation to say more about what is to be done. An early version of this book was titled Racing for Votes, which is a more descriptive title than the one you ultimately went with, Race to the Bottom, which has a clear and negative normative valence. And so just so audiences don't misunderstand, this Race to the Bottom is not just about messaging. The dynamics that Stephens-Dougan specifies is not only about the bottom-feeding behavior among politicians when they are campaigning for votes, it is also about the bottom-feeding behavior of politicians once they're in office, and of voters who are pandered to with this implicit and explicit racial messaging. There are democratically harmful feedback effects to racial distancing. So on page 138, I'll just read this quick quote. Stephens-Dougan writes, racial rhetoric not only has electoral consequences, but also affects the way in which we define public policy problems and ultimately the solutions citizens support to address those problems. End quote. So speech acts are acts, and racial distancing legitimizes and sanctions racially inegalitarian policies. So the Lenin question is, how do we break out of this invirtuous cycle of bottom-feeding rhetoric and its consequences? So let me just stop there, invite Dr. Stephens-Dougan for comment, and then see what we have in the Q&A lineup.
Okay, thank you. You gave me a lot to work with, and I have to say I'm really flattered or honored that you read the work so closely and can even remember some of the earlier iterations. Okay, so your first question about what about Trump? So in some ways, you noted that this started as my dissertation, a dissertation that I started writing in, I don't know, 2009 or something. And so I, in some ways, had the fortune or misfortune of writing and publishing a book that came out literally at a time where sort of the racial landscape has, I think you've suggested, and I would agree with, in which the racial landscape has shifted to some degree, right? So we saw last summer, a summer of, essentially a racial justice protest and racial reckoning in a way, that we hadn't seen in recent years. And so I don't want to kind of just wave my hands in and say, well, I collected my data before, but in some ways, I did collect these data in maybe arguably a different political context. But in terms of, what about Trump? I, think that my theory supports, the behavior of Trump, and the empirics that I lay out in the book also do to some degree, which is that for those whites who, by our metrics are racially conservative or endorse anti-Black stereotypes, you see in the book, they are not perturbed by anti-Black messaging. And I would assume that also travels to other groups as well. Other marginalized groups. And that's precisely what we saw with Trump, right? Which is that, our theories over, some of the longstanding theories about racial messaging and racial priming would have suggested that, oh no, you can't use that type of explicit messaging, that we have these norms that we all adhere to, this norm of racial equality, and that, we've come to some sort of agreement in the post-civil rights era that that type of speech is prohibited. And, even prior to Trump, some of the empirical data that I was collecting and what I was seeing from these survey experiments is that precisely that whether the messenger was white or Black, that, many white racial conservatives were not perturbed by that type of messaging, and they did not find it off-putting. So in terms of what about Trump, it's kind of like, it's not surprising because that type of messaging resonates well with who I refer to as racial conservative whites. Now, your other question about, what about BLM in this context of, racial reckoning, I do think, there are some interesting questions there as to how a candidate then pursues a strategy of racial distancing, or if that is even the optimal strategy at this point. And so, I make a lot of references, and you talked about this, to Obama and kind of the strategy that he pursued during his 2 terms as president. And so to your question as to, what about BLM? I think that there were maybe lessons learned through a presidency of President Obama, where, Fred Harris, for example, political scientist at Columbia, talks about the sort of wink and nod agreement that he had come to with Black voters, where, they kind of gave him a pass for some of that more racially conservative messaging, or messaging where he might have invoked stereotypes talking about, cousin Pookie, or feeding your kids Popeyes fried chicken for breakfast, or, things of that nature. And I think, there were maybe some lessons learned in terms of maybe more accountability for Democratic politicians going forward. And so we could see from like 2012 to 2016 to 2020, particularly, I think, the polling data suggests among younger African Americans that sort of that maybe racial status quo was not going to be sort of sufficient, or, ignoring Black voters and only, being concerned about not alienating white voters was not a sort of successful political strategy that could go forward, particularly if you wanted to turn out and energize and mobilize Black voters in key states, whether, that was Georgia, or, places like Detroit, Michigan, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or, Philadelphia. Oh, were you going to add something? Or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that there are Black voters in these key swing states, and that type of messaging would not suffice in terms of mobilizing those voters. Now, it remains to be seen in terms of white voters who have expressed a commitment to racial justice, and since 2020, how sort of enduring that commitment is, and how, I guess, receptive they will be down the line to more sort of racially liberal messaging. Often, as you well know, we've seen a sort of principal policy gap in American politics, where people often endorse racial equality in principle, but when it comes to actual substantive policy to address those questions, there tends to be a gap between the principle and the policy. So you mentioned about legislation around reparations. My sense of things, I haven't looked at polling data very closely, but that it's wholly unpopular. Things like affirmative action, even among white Democrats, tend to still be pretty politically unpopular. That doesn't mean that Democratic politicians shouldn't and will not pursue racially liberal policies, but
Can I jump in here really quickly, just to insert a question from the audience that's very much related to this? So one version of your answer is that it's kind of a politically meaningless form of virtue signaling that is going on currently. And so Avi Rosenzweig asks, if the political party's calculations involve not losing more white voters than Black voters are gained, and the Republicans are especially uninterested in appealing to Black voters, then why all the tokenizing at rallies where Blacks are placed on camera? And what about Tim Scott being given the spotlight?
Oh, great. Yeah, I love this question. So part of what I talked about earlier is this idea of this political tightrope, right? There's still some degree of not wanting to be seen as racially insensitive. So, often that sort of tokenizing of African Americans and, Trump having, Blacks for Trump and things of that nature, we're even talking about, African Americans, you're living in hell and, whatever that rhetoric was. I would argue a lot of that was to signal to that messaging wasn't for African Americans, but rather for whites who might have been concerned with kind of voting for a candidate who'd be perceived as, racist or, like in American politics or, like the worst thing you can call somebody is a racist, even if we don't really have a sort of agreed upon definition of what that is, right? But like to be called a racist is bad. And so even Trump, as much as, there was an appetite for his base for that explicit messaging, I think there was still, particularly, whether we're calling them soccer moms or suburban moms, that type of demographic that they didn't want to be perceived as voting for, an outright racist. And so that sort of tokenizing and sort of the visual imagery, I think was more for that type of voter to, suggest that they weren't racist. In terms of like someone like a Tim Scott, I think it's great that you brought that up. Part of what I talk about in the conclusion is potentially that, it's maybe easier for either party to have a Black candidate or candidates of color to deliver a more racially conservative message, right? Due to the stereotypes of those politicians as being seen as looking out for the interests of African Americans and having the best interests of Blacks at heart, potentially having someone who's African American deliver that type of message is more credible. So if Tim Scott says, well, he's Black, he knows racism, he's been pulled over 20 or 18 times, whatever. So if he says America is not a racist country, then for sure he's an expert on this. But I see we're also running up against time, so I don't want to go on too long. But
yeah, we're close to time. So let me just ask your quick thoughts on one last question, which kind of bundles a couple of things together. So Joe Biden, who is America's chief decency officer, has read your book and calls you up and says, so how do we get out of this race to the bottom? What's your very quick elevator pitch to him about how we get out of the dynamic which you have so carefully laid out in your book?
Well, I think, and he seems to be going in this direction, I think is kind of ending the Democratic Party's obsession with winning back, working class whites or whatever we're calling, moderate whites to the Democratic Party, and really focusing on a coalition, I think, of racially liberal whites and people of color and mobilizing them, I think, with messages similar to that of what Ian Haney Lopez talks about. So, I totally agree with him on, he finds that the deracialized messaging wasn't especially mobilizing. And I think we're, on similar ground or standing there with that being less effective, but maybe that race plus class message is what can hold the coalition together.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. LaFleur Stephens-Dougan. It was great to see you, great to be introduced to your book, and thank you to the audience for visiting with us today at this book salon event, and thank you to Berkeley Social Science Matrix. Have a great Friday, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.